Hello, and welcome to Top Story Daily Edition. I'm JNS Editor-in-Chief Jonathan Tobin. Thanks for joining me for another discussion on the most pressing issues in the Jewish world. Please like, subscribe, and give us good reviews when you listen to the show. Now let's get started. This isn't the direction the 2024 election cycle had to take, but whether Israelis or pro-Israel Americans wanted this to happen, support for the Jewish state has become a partisan issue. That conclusion became impossible to avoid last week when Senate Majority Leader Charles Schumer gave a speech that signals his support for a change in administration policy about Israel's post-October 7th war on the Hamas terrorist organization. Schumer didn't just back up President Joe Biden's smears about Israel's conduct. He also blamed the continuation of the conflict on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, while calling for what amounts to regime change in Jerusalem. The political context of this broadside was obvious. The speech was coordinated with the White House, which decided it needed a signal from prominent party centrists that they supported his decision to bash Israel. That was appalling in and of itself, but it also made it clear that the increasingly noisy civil war within the Democratic Party over the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians was already over. It resulted in a humiliating defeat for the remaining pro-Israel centrists that Schumer, the self-proclaimed Shomer or guardian of Israel in the Senate, was assumed to be leading, and a victory for progressive leftists who wanted to punish the Jewish state or have altogether embraced terrorism in the form of Hamas. Rather than confronting the anti-Semitism that has become commonplace on the left, Biden's campaign, no doubt influenced by the strong anti-Israel sentiment among party activists, has become convinced that he must act to force Israel to end the war before Hamas is completely defeated if he's going to survive. Some on the Jewish left may think that Schumer's speech represents a new definition of pro-Israel. Such a view asserts that American Jews should override the will of the Israeli people, who may be divided about Netanyahu, but overwhelmingly support the war effort against Hamas and are opposed to a post-war solution that will reward the Palestinians for terrorism. While that argument might have garnered some support before October 7th, the attempt to save Israel from itself simply isn't viable after the Hamas atrocities and the subsequent surge in American anti-Semitism. Schumer should have been telling Biden and his staff that there were a lot more votes to be lost in the center among independents, very much in play this election year, than among leftists who are likely to back the president against Trump in November despite their anger about Israel. Instead, he was meekly going along with the intersectional faction among Democrats who despise both Biden and Schumer as representatives of a fading generation of elderly politicians whose vestigial ties to the Jewish state they intend to replace sooner or later. Biden's decision to appease the intersectional wing of his party became obvious in the lead-up to the Michigan primary. Faced with a challenge from Arab American voters who were outraged by the president's initial strong support for Israel after the October 7th massacres, Biden began a slow retreat from that position. It was highlighted by increasingly hostile statements about the Jewish state, and then the astonishing decision to send a high-ranking delegation of policymakers to apologize to the pro-Hamas mayor of Dearborn, Michigan. In the primary, Biden easily defeated an uncommitted slate that was represented as a protest vote against Israel. Yet somehow his 81 to 13% victory, with much of the anti-Biden vote coming from Arab Americans in the greater Detroit metropolitan area and Dearborn, was interpreted as a sign of his weakness. As polls continued to show him losing both the national vote and battleground states like Michigan to Donald Trump, the assumption that this was due to a lack of enthusiasm in the party's left-wing base because of their anger at Biden for his failure to do something to end the war against Hamas began to take hold. Indeed, even normally sober political observers associated with party moderates, like James Carville, who earned his reputation as a political guru by guiding President Bill Clinton to victories in the 1990s, started to echo this conventional wisdom. Carville claimed on MSNBC that if Democrats were losing to Trump, it was Netanyahu's fault. It's true that Biden is losing ground among younger voters who are more likely to be hostile to Israel, but Democrats are wrong to think that the Gaza war is their biggest problem. Trump is currently ahead because he's making huge inroads among working-class voters, as well as Hispanics and African Americans, whom Democrats took for granted. The Democrats have become a party that is both dominated by and solely interested in the concerns of credentialed elites who are in denial about the way Biden's policies on the economy and illegal immigration have hurt many Americans. If he loses Michigan, it will be because auto workers and Teamsters vote for Trump on those issues, not because campus radicals and Arab Americans hate Israel. The contrast with the Republicans couldn't be greater. In recent decades, the GOP has become a lockstep pro-Israel party. That's due in part to the influence of evangelical Christians who are ardent Zionists and the fact that even more secular conservatives rightly see Israel as a stalwart American ally as well as the only democracy in the Middle East. There are some exceptions. A few stray libertarians like Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky oppose all foreign alliances, even if they aren't hostile to Israel. More troubling are the antagonistic voices on the right, coming from commentators like former Fox News host Tucker Carlson and increasingly open anti-Semites like Candace Owens, who have tilted even farther against Israel since the October 7th atrocities. But almost all GOP office holders agree that the man they are backing for President, Trump, can justly claim the title of the nation's most pro-Israel president, and they support his policies. Trump hasn't said much about the Hamas war in the last 5 months, although he made his differences with the president obvious in interviews given over the past weekend, in which he denounced Biden and Schumer's stand on Israel and said Netanyahu should finish the problem in Gaza, rather than trying, as the administration has been doing, to hold back on an Israeli offensive. Trump just thinks that they should just get it over with. Nor is he wrong to believe that the current war probably wouldn't have happened if he were still president. The calculations of Hamas and their funders in Tehran were clearly impacted not just by their mistaken belief that political divisions inside Israel had made it soft, but because of Biden's weaknesses and pivot away from Trump's policies towards the Jewish state, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Trump's transactional approach to relationships with leaders who overshadowed his record to some extent. He's been vocal about his resentment of Netanyahu because the latter congratulated Biden for beating Trump in 2020, even though it was an obligation to do so as head of his country. And his impatience with Israelis who understand that they have to deal with the Democrats when they're in power in Washington is as great as his ongoing bitterness about the fact that most American Jews didn't back him in spite of his pro-Israel policies. But as his comments illustrated, Trump intends to reverse the Biden policy of appeasing Iran that helped make October 7th possible. His talk about getting back to peace seems also to indicate that, as was the case during his presidency, he won't waste time, as Biden intends to do, on trying to reward Palestinian intransigence and terrorism. Instead, he will return to a policy of trying to continue expanding the Abraham Accords, in which the Arab world normalizes relations with Israel. For the last 25 years, Democrats have reacted with outrage about Republicans claiming to have a better record on Israel when asking for Jewish votes, claiming that even raising the issue undermined a long-standing bipartisan pro-Israel consensus. The idea of that consensus was always more aspirational than a reality, but it did reflect the fact that, for the most part, members of Congress understood that most Americans supported Israel, and that was in their personal interests as well as that of the country to support the alliance. Though the pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC, labored valiantly to preserve the myth of that consensus and was smeared by Israel's anti-Semitic opponents for doing so, its efforts to preserve that idea of a consensus had already begun to fade in 2018 when the first members of the left-wing squad that openly opposed the Jewish state were elected. Democrats were prepared to tolerate the open anti-Semitism of people like Representatives Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, and resisted GOP attempts to hold them accountable. But after October 7th and the surge in anti-Semitism around the country that followed the largest mass slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust, that toleration has turned into appeasement, and a belief that Israel's foes represent the future of their party. The administration's about face for support from the eradication of Hamas is rooted in their belief that Democratic voters will not tolerate a policy of total support for Israel. Republican candidates have no such fears. That still begs the question as to whether this will impact enough Jewish votes to make a difference. Up until now, the answer has always been no. Neither consistent GOP support for Israel nor Trump's historic policies have made much of a dent in the Jewish vote. Most Jewish voters may support Israel, but the overwhelming majority of them who are Democrats do not prioritize the issue. Only Orthodox Jews and political conservatives, who make up less than a third of all Jewish voters, tend to treat Israel as a litmus test for their support. That's probably still the case with most Jewish Democrats, both because they despise Trump and regard Republicans as tribal culture war enemies on issues like abortion, as much as they are political opponents. In the past, though, it was only Orthodox Jews, like those living in places like Brooklyn, where violence is directed against them from minority communities, that felt the impact of violent anti-Semitism. As most college campuses have become hostile environments for Jews, it's now non-Orthodox liberals who are also in the crosshairs of the Jew haters. Whether they're scared enough to vote for a party that is unabashedly pro-Israel is still very much in doubt. But though Biden is still likely to win the Jewish vote in November no matter what happens, it may be that even a slight increase in defections to the GOP could impact the election in swing states like Pennsylvania. Whether or not that happens, the one thing recent events have made clear is that there is no covering up the fact that talk of a bipartisan consensus on Israel is over. Yet even if Republicans win in 2024, that's troubling, since a future in which their opponents are dominated by Israel haters will make it inevitable that the next Democratic administration won't be just critical of Jerusalem, but an open opponent of the Jewish state, no matter who is running it. Schumer's decision to throw in with Biden in bashing Netanyahu because of his policies, which happen to be supported by the overwhelming majority of Israelis, makes it obvious that the Democrats' problem is with the Jewish state and not its leader. The partisan divide on Israel is no longer a matter of conjecture. It is now the reality of American politics in 2024. Thanks for listening. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition and every week for the full hour-long JNS TV program. Whether you're listening to us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself.